Okay. Hello, everyone. Thanks for coming to my defense. It's my great pleasure to have you in my defense. I would also like to thank my audience who come to my live streaming online. It's my great honor to give the talk today. The topic of my talk is mathematical modeling and computational methods for structured populations. My presentation composes of 3 components. The first part is modeling for structured populations. The second part is to develop adaptive spectrum methods in unbounded domains that are applied to solve emerging partial differential models in the structured population models. The third part is to develop control algorithms to control the dynamics of structured populations. First, I would like to go to the first part of my talk, modeling for structured populations. Structured populations arise in many disciplines like biology, ecology, as well as network theories. We model structured cell population proliferation from both macroscopic and microscopic levels, which means that we model cell population from both the cell population density in the mass action model, and we model cell population from the individual cell growth. I would like to first introduce macroscopic modeling for other cellular division mechanisms. How a cell divides and how a cell regulates their size are of crucial biological interests. There are 3 prevailing hypotheses that are used to explain cellular division mechanisms. The first is the timer mechanism, which states that cells tend to divide around a fixed stage. The second is the sizer mechanism, which states that cells tend to divide around a fixed volume. The last one, also the latest one, is the adder mechanism, which states that cells tends to divide after it has accumulated a fixed volume. Here, the volume it has accumulated means the volume it has grown since its birth. So there are mathematical models for the first timer mechanism and the second sizer mechanism. So the division rate can be a function of age as well as size. But there is few mathematical models to explain this adder mechanism. Therefore, we wish to construct a mathematical model to explain this adder mechanism. We developed a combined adder-sizer model because in order to track the added volume, we must also track the volume of the cell. For the macroscopic level, we track the cell density, which is the total number of cells with volume X and added volume Y. We have the deterministic growth rate G. So the cell growth is dx, the volume growth equals to G dt. We also have the division rate beta, as well as the birth rate delta beta. So delta beta is the rate of cell of size X and added size Y giving birth to cell of size Z. So this is the partial differential equation model we have developed. We have the transport equation for cell growth as well as cell division, the right-hand side term, for added size larger than 0. We have the boundary condition. The boundary condition is for newborn cells with added volume 0. We have the initial condition and we have the physical constraint. The physical constraint states that the cell's added volume must be strictly smaller than cell's volume. So we have the full PDE model. First, we would like to compare the numerical results with multicolor simulations to simulate single cell trajectories. Here, the red shadows are the results of the PDE, numerically solving the PDE, and the blue dots are the results from the multicolor simulations. We can see that no matter for the cell density or the cell division events, the PDE numerical results match well with the multicolor simulations. Therefore, our PDE model can accurately simulate what is happening from the individual cell level. With our Adler-Sizer PDE model, we wish to investigate some of most recent biological findings and hypotheses. For instance, a possible blow-up phenomenon in expected cell volume at birth over generations in the single cell level under the Adler mechanism was proposed, which means that the average volume over generations could be very large over time. We found that in our PDE model, if the noise in the division time is large enough, shown by the red curve, then the average cell volume can be very large. If the noise is small, then the cell size can be effectively controlled. So the blow-up phenomenon is owing to the fact that if the noise in the division time is quite large, then there are cells which can live a very long life, and those cells can be very large. This effect can be reduced by incorporating a death term, because a death term can prevent cells from being very long-lived and growing very large. So our PDE model can actually predict the possible cell blow-up behavior. Next, a recent experimental paper hypothesizes that there's some correlation between the mother cell's growth rate and the daughter cell's growth rate, under the assumption that the cell's growth rate is proportional to the cell size. The coefficient lambda can be correlated between two consecutive generations, and R is the correlation strength. The larger R is, the larger the correlation is. We can incorporate this intergenerational memory effect in the cell growth law by adding an extra dimension, lambda, in our model. So we have a 3+1 dimensional PDE model for the correlated cell growth. We found that after running the simulation for the PDE, the larger the correlation strength R is, the larger the mean growth rate lambda is. So this is because if the correlation strength is larger, then cells that grow faster tend to have daughter cells that also grow faster, and eventually those fast-growing cells will account for a larger ratio in the overall cell population, which makes the average growth rate also faster. So the correlation between two consecutive generations can actually change the overall cell growth pattern. The last experimental hypothesis we wish to incorporate is the initiation adder mechanism. Just now, we talked about the adder mechanism, which states that the added volume between two consecutive divisions tend to be a constant. But here, in this recent paper, it is proposed that the added volume between two consecutive initiations tend to be a constant. So here is an illustrative figure. Initiation is the start of DNA replication. We can see that after initiation, the cell gains the added volume 2y2. If the division event is symmetric, Then each daughter cell gets the added volume y2, and from the division event to the initiation event, one of the daughter cell gains a volume y1. So here y1 plus y2 tends to be a constant under the initiation adder mechanism. We can also incorporate this model, this hypothesis in our PD model by splitting the cell density into two sub cell densities. N1, the cell population density before initiation, and N2, the cell population density after initiation. So N1 can convert into N2 through initiation. We also carried out some numerical experiments to numerically solve this PDE. We found that this initiation adder mechanism can lead to effective cell size control. For instance, if there is a cutoff for the pre-initiation cell population, which means that cells must have started initiation before they reach the fixed volume. Here, the cutoff size is 1. Then we can see that as time increases, the cell density pattern seems to saturate. So there's no blow-up phenomenon. So here are the conclusions of this part, macroscopic modeling for cellular proliferation. We developed a PD model that describes the adder cell division mechanism. We also incorporated some recent biological experimental findings in our model, like the blow-up phenomenon, like the intergenerational growth rate memory effect, as well as the initiation adder mechanism. So do you have any questions about this part?
So presumably there's some sort of motivating experiment with this, and you sort of mentioned experiments on the way, right? And then you brought the PD and you confirmed it against stochastic simulations. But does the loop close? Is there like a sense in which this more elaborative PDE system that you built can be used to reconcile with the experimental data, or the experimental data is too limited, or what would you? I guess either can you compare it with experiments, or could you? Is there a version of this that an experiment could be done for, and is that something you kind of contemplated or reached out to people about? Or
Yes, thanks for your question. We have not compared with the experimental results so far. We only compared with the Monte Carlo simulations. But yes, we wish to compare with experimental results for the single cell trajectory data to see if our model is valid. But the problem is in experiments, the coefficients may be difficult to obtain, like the growth rate as well as the division rate.
Well, that's always the concern.
Yeah.
And so the question is like, what's the truth you can unearth through modeling? Is there something that like is qualitatively different about one effect versus another effect, or does it you understand my sort of drift there? Like, you know, if there's like you're doing a model, right? And so at the end you have a beautiful computer animation and cells divide. Right? That's very nice. But like in the sense is like, you know, what scientific truth have we learned from this model? Right? Like what does it enable us to do that we couldn't have done if we didn't have the model? Does that make sense? That's the meta question. And one PhD might not be enough to answer that question. But I'm curious what your thoughts are about, like, you know, if someone was to drop you, make you a Max Planck group leader, right? And this was your golden left. You know what one of those is? They just give you like $1 million and then like start a lab, do whatever you want. What would you do? How would you? Is it clear that you could use a model like this against experiments, or it's just impossible?
Because our model matches well with the Monte Carlo simulations, I suppose we can use our model to infer the coefficients from experiments. For instance, in experiments, we have the single cell trajectory, we have the blue dots, so we can do some kind of inverse problem to infer the parameters in the PD model, so we can have the cell growth rate as well as the cell division rates.
Okay. Can I sort of more detail, similar question, a little more detail? So when you're describing your basic model, you said we're adding these phenomena based on hypothesis of experiments. right? So is it possible that suppose you didn't include some of these things like the intergenerational growth rate memory effect? Did you need to put that in? I mean, you mentioned that you may be able to track, compare with actually experimental growth rates. Is it possible that you could infer from either including or excluding certain of these components of the model, whether or not they're actually important, or that original hypothesis may be wrong? I mean, just because an experimentalist says that this is what they think doesn't mean it is. So I'm just curious. You included these for a reason. Was it just because the paper came out, or because you really believed that they would actually influence the results in a way that were important? So that's the question. I guess. So
yes, that's a very good question. So I guess like the intergenerational memory effect, we can use the original PD model to run some simulation to see if they can match the experimental data. If suppose we know the coefficients, then we run the numerical simulation. Then we replace the model with the extended model to have the effect, to see if the extended model can match the experimental data better. If that's the case, then
can I so this is the moment I'd like to interject. Like, so when you say match the data, like, match what feature? I think that was the thing I was trying to drift toward. Right?
Yeah. I mean,
like, what readout from an experiment you need to match, right? Like, you have a ton of time series. Are the CV squareds like anomalous compared to models that don't have these features? Like, is the variance greater than you'd expect? Is there some kind of like direct correlation measurement? And if so, which correlation would you look at? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
It's kind of funny that we, the math people, are like, tell us about your data, and maybe Shenshen is just like, shut up. Sorry. It's a math PhD. You don't have to have data in it, so you can just push back on this. But sorry, you were going to say.
Is there some qualitative difference without this mechanism that you can look for if they can make data that you want to see? What kind of data would you suggest that can tell whether this memory effect should be present or not? A qualitative distinction that the model would be.
I guess what we need is still the single cell trajectory data. Then we haven't done it so far, but in order to compare, we need to define some meaningful loss functions, either through some Bayesian method or some mean square loss, and to see if the loss function is or which loss function is smaller with the original PD model or with our proposed extended like the intergenerational memory effect model. So which loss function is smaller?
But that's just the residue, right? So the residue on top, like, what would be what's the thing that you're measuring that you're trying to, like, experimental data is like axis X and prediction is axis Y. What is the actual number that goes there? Like the time between generations? Is that all you have? The volume? What's your actual readout that you would get from the experiments?
I think we need the cell density, maybe not cell density, at several discrete time points, the states of all cells in the population.
So you really need to know everything, because you don't generally get that, right? You get like a few measurements, and maybe you don't get time course, or maybe you get like time course, but it's just like it's kind of limited. You get single counts. You don't get to follow all of the cells all of the time. But I think we are asking you about things that don't really live within that PhD. So I'm happy for you to continue.
The PD is just for the density, so that's all. I mean, I guess they can take many cells and average.
But there was this sort of sense in which, like, the complexion of the population changed over time, right? Like, can you genotype for that? Or, I don't know. It seems like there was a prediction then under that. Anyway, I should have continue.
Yeah, that's maybe the blow up. Blow up. Down.
Okay. Thanks for your questions. I really appreciate that. The second half of my part 1 is kinetic theories for structured populations. So here we wish to model cellular population proliferation from the microscopic level, which means that we model single cell trajectories. Cellular growth is interrupted by random division events. That's from the individual cell level, because the cell division times is usually random, and also cellular growth rates are fluctuating. That means in addition to the deterministic growth law, we often observe some fluctuation in the cellular growth rate. So there is no model so far for cellular proliferation that contains randomness in both division times and cellular growth from the individual cell level. Therefore, we wish to construct a rigorous mathematical model to incorporate both types of randomness.
So is it, I mean, if this question answer quickly. So you're talking about randomness in both division time. I mean, presumably division times and various other things are temperature dependent. So, I mean, do people have models for just variable coefficient division times based on environmental parameters? And so you're specifically doing randomness, or is it just, are there any models that just include variations with respect to the environment as opposed to random division times?
Yeah, that's a good question. We did not include the effect of environment in our model. We just consider the intrinsic properties, features that will affect cells division. But I think it's interesting to see how the division times will change under different environments. So that's a more experimental question, I suppose.
So it's no model plus randomness, as opposed to, you're not saying that there's no model for environmental influence on division times.
I guess there are models for the influence of the environment.
Yeah, you freeze it there and it divides. So.
Yeah. Thanks for asking.
Okay.
So, in the normal structured population model, the growth rate is deterministic, like dx equals to g dt. But developing a model that incorporates noise in growth rate is possible. For instance, we can replace the deterministic growth law by the stochastic differential equation dx equals to g dt plus a noise sigma dwt. We also assume that cell division rate is age dependent. So the division rate depends on cell's age A. Under these two assumptions, we construct a full kinetic theory with both age and size dependence for cellular proliferation. Note that a kinetic theory for structural cell population was constructed with only age dependent, but there's no model that was constructed with both size and age dependence.
So we one more time. Need to do the model for a second. So the dependence upon AT is the issue. So if AT is one more time.
AT is the age of the cell.
Okay. So that's been used, but then. Sorry.
Yes, that is used in a previous model.
So G is dependent on X, is what you're saying.
Yeah, G depends on X. G can also
figure out what the new function is. G of X is the new function.
Yeah, G of X and T. G can also depend on A. So here is our model setup. Cells are divided into two categories, the singlets and doublets. Doublets are twins, which means two cells born from the division of the same mother cell. So they share an identical age, but their sizes could be different. Singlets means cells which do not have a sibling. So we use X to denote the volume of singlets, Y to denote the volume of doublets, A to denote the ages of singlets, and B to denote the ages of doublets.
So there's some someone, or what makes me a singlet? How do I be a singlet?
So suppose we have a twin right now, but one cell divides before the other
okay,
divides.
so they're no longer my sibling.
Yes,
Okay.
yes, exactly. Yes, thanks for the clarification. So we track the probability density function of a system having m singlets and n doublets, denoted by rho of m and n. With the Ito's formula, we can derive the partial differential equation for evolution of cell population of n singlets and n doublets. So we have the age growth term, we have the size growth term, we have the fluctuation in the size term, the second order term. We also have the division rates. So we derive this by using the Ito's formula. We also have the boundary condition. The boundary condition are for newborn cells, where if we assume at most one cell in the system can divide when the time interval dt is small enough, then we have this boundary condition. The first term stands for the division of a singlet, giving birth to a newborn doublet. The second term stands for the phenomenon that one cell in a doublet divides, giving birth to a newborn singlet and leaving the other cell as a new singlet. So we have the partial differential equation, we have the boundary condition for the cell population density, which track every cell in the population. But sometimes we may also wish to discover the evolution law satisfied by some macroscopic quantities. Therefore, we can do some marginalization to the cell density. Here, we track H singlets, K single cells in K doublets, which means that we integrate the size of the other cell out. And L doublets, we have this rho of M and then HKL. So this is complicated, and we have the differential equation satisfied by this quantity. So this is used to construct some meaningful macroscopic quantities like the population density with respect to cells size X and cell size age A at time t, which we denote as U or 1 and 0 because we are only tracking one cell. Mm-hmm.
Do the cells die?
Now we assume that the cells only divide, they don't die. But yes, in this paper, we have an extension where cells can die. But for
Depends on the
yes, the death rate can depend on cells number and cell states. So for the cellular density U10, the PDE it satisfied is this PDE. We can see that by incorporating the fluctuation in the cell growth rate, we have an extra second order term here. We have the division. The boundary condition stands for newborn cells.
So is this, I mean, could I just have got that directly in field PV?
Yes, this is
like
a
maybe
field.
you get to it from marginalization.
Mhm.
Just, are you getting to this from rigorous marginalization?
Yes, yes.
But you could just derive it directly, right? It's just proper planned from your, like your stochastic model, isn't it? Am I missing something? I gave a flux term that's G, I have a diffusion term that's sigma, I have like an advection because everything just gets older. I mean, this is just, I could just write this down.
Yes, intuitively, yes, we can write this down.
I just wanted to check.
Mhm,
I'm congratulating myself that I know this stuff. That's all.
Mhm. Yes, we are just providing some rigorous mathematical grounds for this because there's randomness in both the cells division time and the growth rate. So So we wish to develop a rigorous mathematical model for this. Intuitively, this is correct. So with this new model that incorporates randomness in both division times and the growth rates, we wish to investigate how the noise in the cellular growth rate affect the cell population pattern. We construct the mean cell size, and we observed that the larger the randomness in the division rate is, the larger the mean size is. So larger noise in growth rates lead to border distributions of cell sizes that increase the mean size, which means that we can have very large cells, and those large cells will grow faster, and the mean size will then be larger. So the fluctuation in the cell's growth rate actually can play a very important role in the cell population pattern.
So do you ever have like pathologies, given that you've done this rigorous analysis, do you have like pathologies like cells that just keep shrinking because of this the Wien effect?
Now we
followed like the extreme objective.
Now we didn't get the shrinking pattern in our PD model, but I guess that is possible by trying out different combination of coefficients or something. We can also derive the partial differential equations satisfied by other higher order macroscopic quantities, like if we are tracking the density with respect to k singlets and l doublets, denoted by u of k and l, we can derive the partial differential equation satisfied by those quantities. The PDEs are all closed by themselves, but they are correlated through the boundary conditions, like this pattern, like u of 0 and 1, which means that we are tracking, we're only tracking one pair of one doublets. The boundary condition for u of 0 and 1 depends on u1, 0. So we have this interesting interdependence through the boundary conditions, which means that we can actually solve the density satisfied by adding high order quantities through this boundary correlation pattern, but this is a little bit too complicated, so we don't include the complete differential PDE here for those higher order quantities. So here are the conclusions for this part. We derived kinetic equations for structured cellular proliferation models. Both randomness from cellular growth and division times are incorporated, which cannot be directly modeled from the macroscopy level. We can write some equations intuitively, but it will be a little bit difficult to prove them, because yes, we can have the Fokker Planck equation, but we have the division, the newborn cells, so it's hard to directly construct the boundary condition from the Fokker Planck equation. But in our kinetic model, by modularization, we can obtain the differential equations satisfied by a family or macroscopic quantities of interest, which we denote by u of k and l. Thanks for your attention. So, do you have any questions about this part? Okay, great. I will go to the second part of my presentation, adaptive spectral methods in unbounded domains. Just now, we talked about the blow-up behavior, where cells' average size could be very large over time. So tracking cellular size blow-up requires solving an unbounded domain spatial temporal PDE, because we don't know how large the average size could become. There lacks efficient numerical PDE solvers for spatial temporal unbounded domain problems, especially when the solution can display some dynamic behavior over time. Therefore, in order to efficiently and accurately solve the blow-up model, we develop efficient scaling, moving, and p-adaptive techniques for spectral methods in unbounded domains for spatial temporal PDEs. Here is the outline of this part. I will first introduce 3 adaptive techniques for spectral methods. The scaling technique, which adjusts the shape of the basis functions dynamically, the moving technique, which adjusts the displacement or the center of the basis functions adaptively, and the p-adaptive technique, which adjusts the expansion order of the spectral expansion. Combining them all together, we will have an adaptive spectral method in unbounded domains. As an illustrative example, we numerically solve the PDE for structured cell population. This is a sizer timer model in which we track the cell's age as well as cell size. We have the boundary condition. So if we give some spatial coefficients, we have an analytic solution to that PDE. So the analytic solution, the average size for this analytic solution is 5 plus t, which grows linearly over time. The reason for this is that the function is decaying more and more slowly in the size variable over time. We have the e to the power minus x over 5 plus t here.
So taking a couple of steps back from this,
Mm-hmm.
Going into this, probably the least knowledgeable person on spectral methods in this room,
Mm-hmm.
is there like a context that's me?
Mm-hmm.
Is there a context why I would be looking at spectral methods for these kinds of problems? I mean, I'm trying to match biological data, which, like if I'm within a factor of 10, I'm fine with,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
right? So I'm not like aiming for highly precise predictions.
Mm-hmm.
There aren't really any singularities or very fine scale features in my data that I'm going to struggle to resolve with finite differences.
Mm-hmm.
Is there could you very briefly in one sentence motivate why I would be looking to do spectral methods?
Mm-hmm.
And Chris can just slap me down.
Mhm,
So,
mhm.
No, it's a good question.
But,
To answer that, it's a lot of work to do this. So
Yeah,
how do
I
you
mean,
use them?
it sounds like a huge amount of work.
Yes.
I'm just kind of curious when I look at your PV and I'm
Mhm.
like, well, if I just finite difference
Mhm.
and hope for the best,
Mhm.
why would I be wrong in doing that?
Yes, I think that's a very important question. For static problems, even in unbounded domains, finite difference methods or finite element methods, they can be quite helpful. But now we are doing a spatial temporal problem where the solution can display dynamic behavior over time. So if we truncate the domain, that could not work so well. Let's take a look at one simple example. E to the power minus x squared to t plus 1. So if we truncate the domain to be minus 100 to 100, then in the beginning when t equals to 0, this is very small. This is quite small. This is approximately 0. So we can do that. But as t evolves, let's say if t is 9,999, then
So
you...
that's not my question, because I
Mhm.
totally believe you about moving domain and
Mhm.
expanding domain being really important.
Mhm.
I guess my question is about the spectral element.
Mhm.
Because moving domain is something that we do in finite element. We do it in finite difference. It's a big, important technique in numerical math. What I'm wondering is given that everything with spectral is harder, why does it have to be spectral that you embed this in? Why couldn't you do finite difference with an expanded domain? Does that make sense?
Yes, I guess for the finite difference of finite element, for this spatial temporal problem, typically we don't know how to expand the domain. And the most important question is that first we need to truncate the domain. So after truncating the domain, we will lose the information outside the domain. So even if we can expand, we are doing the expansion based on some assumptions on the function's behavior, but we don't actually know that. But for the spectral methods, the basis functions are naturally defined in the whole domain. which means that in the beginning, we can know the solution's behavior in the domain. We don't need to truncate the domain anymore.
No, but I mean,
Mhm.
this is a programming thing. You
Mhm.
create a buffer region and you just look and see how much is out there. You have a time evolving situation, right?
Mm-hmm.
If you know initially you're inside the box,
Mm-hmm.
you can just compute over a buffer region. As soon as that starts to fill up, and say, "Oh, I need to make a bigger box, or I need to move the box."
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's just a programming thing. There's nothing unique about identifying how big the domain has to be and where it needs to be. I mean, you can, because you have a temporal thing, you can actually predict in advance, and then you don't have to truncate and then figure it out. You do it and then you truncate.
Mm-hmm.
I guess is my point.
Mm-hmm.
This is kind of like the opposite problem we like is like very well known, right? Like where you have to increase the density of points. Like an adaptive mesh refinement is like totally
Mm-hmm.
like I mean not trivial. I mean it's like challenging, but it's something that everyone's seen. But I just sort of feel like it's sort of reflective of the fact that generally the problems we look at tend to sort of develop smaller and smaller scale features that we're trying to resolve.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I can't think of a specific example, but I feel like adding extra points in a finite difference domain is
Mm-hmm.
not harder than that, and probably a lot easier because I'm not struggling with piecing density around it. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
But I think that this is your answer. You've given me your answer, which is like you want to use spectral because it is your belief that the moving domain demands it, right?
Mm-hmm.
Rather than the something about fine scale features. I'm not sure I agree with that. I don't know if that would be. I don't know. I mean, Chris, do you have any?
Well, let me just ask you this. I mean, you're solving essentially heat equations, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so over time they get smoother, correct?
Mm-hmm.
So the point is I'll just answer your question. You like to take advantage of that.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the point is that if you have an expanding domain with finite differences, you just have to add more points. But the point is, if you can get by with fewer spectral modes, because the solution is smoother, you could actually imagine going further in time with the same number of degrees of freedom. So that's the reason why we use spectral.
You could also sparsify the points.
Yeah, but then it'd be a little bit more. Yeah, you're right. You could.
I'm just sort of asking, why, the stupid approach is actually stupid, which is, you just sit down and finite differences and just keep changing the finite difference grid to keep up with what the solution is.
Well, you can take advantage. The thing is, he's taking the spectral methods take advantage of smoothness.
Okay.
I mean, that's. I mean,
Yes.
do you agree with that answer, or do you disagree?
Yes, the spectral method can provide very high accuracy if the function is smooth in space.
And I guess part of the thing you're going to point at is the fact your n there is 20 rather than 20,000. Like in your box of the line.
Mm-hmm.
Your n
Yeah,
is
the n number of
20 rather
modes.
than 20,000.
It's just 20. We only need 20 basis functions.
Yeah.
We're helping you, yes.
Yes.
20. Good job.
You go.
Yes, for traditional methods like finite difference method and finite element methods, for solving the spatial temporal problems, we usually do not know how large a computational domain is needed. And if the domain is quite large, we need many nodes, a huge number of nodes and meshes in that domain. But if the function is smooth enough, then we apply the spatial method with quite a few number of basis functions. Also, after truncating the domain, we need to construct artificial boundary conditions. That could be a complicated and subtle question, but we need to solve that for the two methods. They are helpful for solving problems where there are breakpoints in bounded domains, but in the unbounded domains when the functions is smooth, spectral method could be a better choice because
Good question. So spectral methods don't need artificial boundary conditions?
they don't need artificial boundary conditions because the basis functions are naturally defined in the whole domain.
You have a compact basis function?
We have like the Hermite functions that's defined in the whole domain, so we don't need to truncate the domain.
Okay. So you're saying because it decays in a one function.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. This is a typical spectral expansion, but we have several hyperparameters like the scaling factor, the translation or the displacement of the spectral of the basis functions, as well as the expansion order, capital N. So those hyperparameters actually play an important role in the numerical success for spectral methods, and we wish to determine how to adjust those hyperparameters in a spatial temporal problem. For adaptive numerical methods, generally speaking, there are three adaptivities. R adaptivity, which is to redistribute collocation points. H adaptivity, which is to introduce new collocation points. And P adaptivity, which is to adjust the degree or basis functions for finite element methods. We will show later that the three adaptive techniques we develop for our spectral method can match the three adaptivities for other adaptive numerical methods. First, I will talk about the scaling technique. Let's take a look at this simple function in the semi-unbounded domain. If we use the generalized Lagrange functions that decays exponentially at infinity to approximate it, a proper scaling factor is needed. If the scaling factor is larger, then the basis function will decay faster. If it's too large, like beta equals to 4, then the basis functions decay faster than the function to be approximate, and the approximation is poor. By choosing an appropriate beta, the approximation is accurate. So in a spatial temporal problem, the function may display some dynamic behavior over time. We approximate the diffusive Fermi-Dirac distribution. We can see that as time increases, the function is decaying more and more slowly at infinity. It is becoming more and more diffusive. Therefore, we need to decrease the scaling factor for the basis functions to make the basis functions also decay more and more slowly at infinity. By doing so, we can maintain a small error. Therefore, it is diffusive behavior that requires scaling. So how do we scale the basis functions? How do we measure diffusivity of the function to be approximate over time? We measure diffusivity by high frequency components. Because in a spectral expansion, usually high frequency components decay more slowly than low frequency components at infinity. So for such a spectral decomposition, we define its frequency indicator as the proportion of high frequency components over the proportion of components from all frequencies. If this frequency indicator increases, we know that the function is becoming more diffusive, and we may need to decrease the scaling factor to make the basis functions also decay more slowly at infinity, and vice versa.
So this is only the spectral decomposition for Hermite functions, right?
For
Because the
Hermite,
eigenstates, the high frequencies become more unbounded, which is just the opposite when you're doing the diffusion equation where they damp quickly in time, right? So this is an appropriate indicator for Hermite spectral decompositions.
yes, as well as for the Lagrange functions.
Yeah, but I mean, the point is it's not like sines and cosines.
No. Sines and cosines, they are defined in bounded domains. So
Right, they're bounded domains, but they also damp quickly by diffusion process. Because they're fast, so you don't see them if they're localized.
yes, so this is now we apply to Hermite functions, Lagrange functions, as well as generalized Jacobi functions. That's where the high frequency components decay more slowly than low frequency components.
In space.
Yes, in space, exactly.
So thing, like on the details, is gamma I just multiplied by ui squared, or is gamma I somehow dependent on the coefficients? I'm a little.
Yeah, gamma I is just a norm of the i's basis function.
I see, but how does this change over?
This depends on beta. This only depends on beta.
I see, but beta is just your scaling factor.
Yes,
so
yes.
How as my solution evolves, is ui being affected in this? I don't see how UI is being used.
UI is the expansion is the spectral expansion coefficient. It is a function of time.
So is gamma I multiplied by UI squared?
Yes, this
Okay,
is.
so it's not gamma I of UI.
Oh no,
That's
sorry.
what I wanted to check. Is it like
Ah.
then I got very confused.
Uh,
Okay,
yeah,
I
yes.
understand now. So it's gamma I times
Yes.
UI squared.
yes, times UI. Yes.
Okay.
Yes, thanks for clarification.
Tom told me not to let any error in any slide go past us. So,
A natural question to ask is whether the scaling technique is enough for spectral methods to solve unbounded domain spatial temporal problems. And the answer is no, because we found that spatial translation of the function may cause a false increase in the frequency indicator that cannot be resolved by adjusting the scaling factor beta. As an illustrated example, we approximate the moving Fermi-Dirac distribution. So we can see that as time increases, the function in the semi-unbounded domain is moving rightward. No matter how we change the scaling factor, the arrow is huge, shown as the purple curve, and the frequency indicator keeps increasing. So we cannot control the frequency indicator by changing the scaling factor. The right thing to do, also the natural thing to do, is to move the basis functions accordingly to match the translation of the function to be approximate. By doing so, we can recover spectral convergence with the expansion order. So how do we determine whether we should move the basis functions over time? We define this exterior arrow indicator. So for the semi-unbounded domain problem with generalized Lagrange functions, this exterior arrow indicator could measure the arrow of the approximation arrow bound in the exterior domain xr to infinity over the arrow bound in the whole domain. So if this indicator increases, then we know that the approximation at infinity is deteriorating. Therefore, we may need to move the Lagrange functions rightwards to make the approximation at infinity better. We call the moving technique the edge-adapted technique as a result of this following example. We approximate the function in the semi-unbounded domain. We can see that as time increases, new oscillations keep coming into this region, as shown by the red curve. Therefore, we need to move the spectral functions rightward to match the exponential decaying part. We also need to introduce new grids or new meshes to capture the incoming oscillations over time. So incoming oscillation require additional allocation points, and we call the moving technique edge-adapted technique. By moving the basis functions rightward and introducing new grids, the arrow in the outer domain as well as in the whole semi-unbounded domain can be controlled well.
So reconciling this with the kind of problem that you're interested in solving, this population dynamics problem. So clearly population dynamics doesn't produce dynamics that are as dynamic-y as this. Like what we saw in your first graphs were things like you'd have like a bimodal distribution of whatever. Right? So this thing's moving rightward. So that's the thing you're going to keep track of using your moving spectral methods?
Yes. Yes.
The other thing that might be moving leftward, does that matter? Like, can you just take care of it by introducing more bases, or do you have to? I'm just wondering what you do if you have two features that have different velocities, like that, which is the sort of thing that you do see in your data. Like is it less challenging than this? More challenging than this? About the same?
Actually, generalize the moving technique to allow the functions to move leftward for the whole unbounded domain problems. But I guess your question is interesting. If we have two group velocities, we haven't thought about this feature so far, but it could be a more challenging question because, like for spectral methods, it's decaying at infinity. So if the two velocity are very different, then over time we have two peaks. That could be a challenging problem.
What do you think you need to do? What do you think is going to happen when if you have two diverging distributions? What do you think you're going to need to change? I mean, not changing the algorithm, but what is your expected observation about what the algorithm will do?
I think in that case, we may need two sets of basis functions. We didn't try our algorithm with one set of basis function on the two different group velocity problem. But in that case, I guess when it's a multi-scale problem and we may need two different sets of basis functions to resolve that.
Oh, not just more. You'd actually
orthogonality. Is that? Wow.
Yes, for one set of basis function, they are orthogonal to each other. So if we apply one set of basis function, we observe that there's still one peak, then we may need to add more basis functions, or actually maybe we need two different sets, but we haven't tried that so far. That is an interesting question because that's even richer dynamics for the unbounded domain problems. Next, we wish to ask, are the scaling technique and the moving technique enough for solving spatial temporal unbounded domain problems? And the answer is still no, because we observe that oscillatory behavior that varies over time requires adjusting the expansion order property. So I believe that could be related to the two group velocity. If we have two peaks that separates, then the function is becoming more oscillatory, and that might be resolved by adding more basis functions. So we don't need two sets, but that's one possibility. We haven't tried that. Also, in some cases, adaptively adjusting the expansion order can boost efficiency, which means that we can reduce the number of basis functions when we don't need so many basis functions. So how do we determine whether we need to increase or decrease the number of basis functions? Because high frequency components are usually more oscillatory than low frequency components. We can still use the same frequency indicator to determine the oscillation of the spectral expansion and to determine whether we need to increase or decrease the number of basis functions. If the frequency indicator increases, then we know the function is becoming more oscillatory and we may need more basis functions, and vice versa.
So this then motivates, like, this is, I think everyone nods here, right? We know high frequency means more fine scale stuff, when possible under resolution. When you were doing your scaling with beta, you used the same measure, which you've shown us. Is there a reason, like, it feels like they get dragged along together then, which is a little bit concerning. Like, wouldn't it also just like look at like the L1 weight outside of a certain domain or something if you want to figure out how large scale your solution is? Like going back, like this one I fully agree with, but now it's making me concerned about the previous one. But like, you're using frequency twice, and like there might be some drag or like some numerical inefficiency associated with it.
That's a good question. Yes, there could be some other useful metrics that we could use for our adaptive spectral methods to determine the scaling problem. For this, actually, I will explain later. If scaling can keep this frequency indicator small, then we just do scaling. We don't need to increase the number of basis functions. So actually, scaling can help us maintain accuracy without increasing computational costs. So as an example, we numerically solve the PD in the bounded domain. So in the bounded domain problem, we don't have the diffusive behavior. It's not unbounded. We also don't have the translated behavior, which means that the solution could move to infinity. The function can only become more or less oscillatory over time. And in our example, the function is becoming more oscillatory over time. This is the analytic solution. So because the function is becoming more oscillatory over time, we need to introduce more basis functions to capture the oscillations. By properly increasing the number of basis functions, and we can maintain a small error as well as a small frequency indicator.
And what's your basis function now?
So the basis function is a Chebyshev polynomials.
Yeah.
So here is a full adaptive spectrum method we developed for unbounded domain problems. So because the translated behavior could cause a forced increase in the frequency indicator, then we first need to rule out this phenomenon by carrying out the moving technique. Then we do scaling. If we can properly change the scale of the basis functions to maintain a small frequency indicator, then we just do scaling. We don't need to increase the number of basis functions. Actually, we also proved that the scaling factor, the frequency indicator is an error bound for the spectral approximation. After the scaling process, we determine whether we need to refine by increasing the number of basis functions or whether we can coarsen, which means that we can reduce the number of basis functions. So this is the full adaptive spectrum method that we developed.
And your time stepping is What's your time stepping?
We tried many different time forwarding schemes, like the Craig-Nicholson, like the exponential scheme, and the simplest is the forward Euler or backward Euler scheme.
Well, I was going to ask about that. So how does this work? Like things implicitly, like adding the basis terms and all of these things. Do you have to like interpolate to get them, or like what's the the issue with backward Euler is always initialization. There's probably more issues, Chris can say, but like, do you have? My concern is when you add more stuff. You might affect stiffness, but I'm terrified to ask that question because I wouldn't understand your answer. So I turn to Chris. But the other thing is, like if you're using an implicit scheme and the basis keeps changing, just the raw details of how you solve this implicit equation is going to be tricky. Or is it straightforward and everything?
It's a great question, and actually we keep the basis functions fixed between two consecutive time scales. It is only we obtain the solution at the next time step, then we determine whether we need to change the shape, the displacement, or the expansion order. So the adaptive techniques will not interfere with the numerical scheme to forward time.
So you just interpolate it onto the new, because it's like it's a different support if it's a different basis.
Yes, we start from the current time step, and from this time step to the next time step, we keep the basis functions fixed. At the next time step, after obtaining the numerical solution, then we determine whether we need to change the basis functions accordingly. But we don't need to change the basis functions in our numerical scheme.
But when I rescale my basis functions, I have to recalculate all of my coefficients. So
Yes.
Like all of those, I don't even know what they're called when you do my polynomials, but like Fourier transforms.
Yes.
Is that costly? Is it meaningful?
Yes. After having the new numerical solution, then if we determine we need to change the basis functions, then we calculate the coefficients under the new basis functions.
Okay.
That's not very computationally costly. That's just the ON or ON square calculation.
Well, n is small.
Yeah, n is small.
Yeah. Otherwise,
I know I'm the primary reason why you're going slow, but it's 3:20, so you've gone for an hour and 10. I'm wondering, I will shut up before I'm done.
I guess it's
I don't
only
think-
10 minutes.
10 minutes?
Yeah,
Okay,
10 minutes.
Perfect. Good.
So, as a complicated example, we numerically solve the Schrödinger equation. The function is becoming more diffusive over time, and it is moving rightwards. It is also becoming more oscillatory. Therefore, we need to apply all three techniques. By doing so, we can maintain the error small. Failure to incorporate any one of those techniques will result in much larger errors. So our adaptive spectrum method is quite useful. We also carried out some preliminary numerical analysis for our adaptive spectrum methods. For this parabolic model problem, we have the following error estimates. The final time error is bounded by the summation of the error from numerical discretization, the time forwarding scheme, the error from applying the scaling technique, from applying the moving technique, and from applying the coarsening technique. Noting that introducing new basis functions will not introduce new errors. So for the numerical discretization error, it takes the following form. It is complicated, but the implication is that we need to keep this norm small, the projection error. So that explains why we need the adaptive spectrum methods, because with the proper scaling factor, expansion order, and displacement, we can keep the projection error small. So this justifies our adaptive spectrum methods in the spatial temporal problems. For the three adaptive errors, they took the following forms. Those are complicated, but we can obtain some meaningful message from these forms. Like for the scaling error ES, more accurately adjusting the scaling factor and avoid adjustments, we can reduce the adjustment in the scaling factor beta delta minus beta here, and this error can be kept small. Similarly, for moving, if we more accurately adjust the displacement and avoid over-adjustment, we can reduce XL minus XL delta, which is the change in the displacement. We can keep this term small. For coarsening, if high accuracy is desired, then setting a threshold for coarsening to be higher, we can reduce the coarsening error. The extreme case is that we do not reduce the expansion order at all, and then we don't have this term, you see. But there is a efficiency and accuracy trade-off for coarsening. So here are the conclusions. We developed three adaptive techniques for spectrum method: the scaling technique, the moving technique, and the p-adaptive technique. A combined algorithm leads to an adaptive spectrum method for solving spatial temporal problems in unbounded domains. So do you have questions for this part? Okay, great. Thanks for listening, and I will go to the last part, which is also a short part of my presentation. Part 3, control the dynamics of structural populations. Different structural populations arise in interdisciplinary fields, and controlling the dynamics of structural populations is of realistic significance, like controlling the spread of disease. I will introduce mathematical models for devising testing and vaccination strategies to control spread of disease. Testing can help us identify and quarantine infected persons with smaller costs because we don't need to quarantine anyone. And vaccination can help us protect the most vulnerable people from being infected. In a recent paper, an agent-based model is proposed to quantify the risk for different individuals in a social network, as shown by the green bars. And those persons whom are perceived to be at the highest risk are selected and tested. This method is useful, but it may need a huge amount of data if we wish to apply to to a very large group of population, because we need the accurate, precise interpersonal contact time data. Another approach is to use the mean field models to describe a very large population and efficiently define and compute optimal control strategies. So we will construct mean field models for devising testing and vaccination strategies. But in the mean field models, we also need to give up individual resolution and some possible higher order degree correlations. So two networks will be considered in our mathematical models. The Barabasi-Albert model, where the degree distribution decays exponentially with the degree, and the stochastic block model. So it's like we have several different neighborhoods, and the connection in each neighborhood is dense, but the connection is sparse between two neighborhoods. So we modify the SIR model to characterize the different degrees of persons. The degree here means the number of close contacts. We also divide the infected compartment into two subcompartments, the untested group and the tested group. So the untested group can be converted into the tested group through testing. And F of L, the red term, is the testing budget given to subpopulation with degree L. Usually, the infectious rate for the tested group is much smaller than that of the untested group because we quarantine those who are tested positive. So our goal is to minimize infections by minimizing the loss function. So it is the new infections at time t multiplied by a discount factor. So the discount factor means that we penalize earlier infections more than later infections because at later times we may have more medical resources. In order to minimize this L, an equivalent condition is to minimize this Hamiltonian edge, where lambda are the Lagrangian multipliers. So here, the term marked in red is the risk for subgroup L. The larger it is, the larger the risk is for that subgroup. And our strategy is to maximize the testing budget with the largest risk. So here are the results. Under this testing budget and this recovery rate, we found that for the two different social networks, the strategy is to test those with the highest degrees at the beginning. But as time evolves, when those people are almost infected, then we turn to people with smaller degrees. By doing so, we can effectively control early time infections in both networks, as shown in the red curve. Here, the black curve means we are doing nothing, we are not testing anyone, and the blue dashed curve means that we are doing a uniform strategy, means that we are giving equal priority to people with different degrees. Our optimal strategy can effectively reduce early time infections. So, testing can help us identify which persons we need to quarantine, and vaccination can protect the most vulnerable people from being infected. We assume that people with different degrees are given different priorities to vaccines, and the susceptible persons can be converted to the recovered group through vaccination, as we assume vaccines provide full protection after one dose. Our goal is to also minimize the loss function, which is the infections at time t multiplied by the discount factor. In order to minimize this L, equivalently, we are to minimize this Hamiltonian. Here, the risk is marked by the red term. Our strategy is also to maximize the vaccines given to subpopulation with degree L with the largest risk. We perform a numerical experiment with the same recovery rate and this vaccination budget for the two different networks. We found that in the Barabasi-Albert network, it is hopeful that we can control the spread of disease, because as long as we vaccinate those with the highest degrees, the disease will be the spread of disease will be cut off because only very few people have large degrees and most people have very small degrees. In the SBM network, even if we cannot fully contain the spread of disease with the Pontryagin maximum principle based algorithm, we can control the early time infections. The strategies for both networks is to vaccinate those with largest degrees in the beginning. Sometimes we may not have access to the exact dynamics, or we may not have access to the future time budget. So we can perform reinforcement learning to choose our next action based on our current situation. So we input the current situation, we perform reinforcement learning to use a network to output a state value function, which is analogous to the loss function in the Pontryagin maximum principle approach. Actually, we found that we could use the PMP approach to pre-select the possible optimal actions for the reinforcement learning training, because the action space is usually continuous for the RL method. But we found that under the PMP approach, the optimal strategies can only occur on the extreme points in the action space. So the set of extreme points is a finite set. So we can use that finite set as our action space to greatly boost training efficiency. Although the reinforcement learning cannot beat the PMP approach because PMP has the full information over time and it can always explicitly give us a close to optimal solution, the reinforcement learning still performs much better than the uniform strategy. But because the action space is still quite large, even after dimension reduction, reinforcement learning may be stuck in some local optima, and it's not as well as the PMP approach. Nonetheless, if we don't have future information, then we can only apply the reinforcement learning training, and this could be very helpful. Finally, we wish to apply the optimal strategy we obtained to the real-world data like the discrete agent-based network models. So we found that, as shown by the red solid curves, if we apply the PMP approach to the agent-based models, the infections, especially the early time infections, can be effectively reduced in both network models. Also, we found that the predicted infections in the mean field model is much larger than that in the multicolor simulation. This is because in the mean field model, everyone is well connected to different subpopulations. But in the real world agent-based model, the network can become disconnected after some people gain immunity, and then fewer people will be infected. So here are the conclusions for this part. We develop PMP approaches that could give optimal strategies for controlling pandemics. PMP approach can also refine the possible action space for reinforcement learning. We also implement the PMP strategies to agent-based discrete models. And we found that those strategies are still useful. Maybe they are not optimal, but they are useful. And those agent-based models tend to have smaller infections than the mean field models. So do you have questions about this part? Okay, great. Here is a brief summary of my PhD research. My PhD research focused on 3 areas of studying structured populations. First, I developed multi-scale mathematical models from both the macroscopic level and the microscopic level. Then, I devised efficient unbounded domain numerical PDE solvers to solve the emerging numerical challenges in those macroscopic population dynamics models. Finally, I devised efficient control algorithms to control the spread of disease in the structured population dynamics model. So do you have any questions? Okay. Thanks for listening. Thanks for coming to my talk. I really appreciate your coming to my talk.
I got further questions.
Okay.
I got a lot.
Yeah.
Okay, so
All right,
now we
discuss a bit.
yeah, we send you out. Can you post your feed or mute it or something?
Okay. Okay. I will.
Mute it.
Okay. Thanks for coming to my presentation, and now I will need to close the live streaming. I really appreciate you coming to my presentation today. Thank you.